All right, friends, if we could resume. I'd like to introduce you to two outstanding veterans of the DC sort of journalism orbit in Eugene Scott and Will Salatan. This session is sort of right at the sweet spot of what Faith Angle tries to offer and support journalists in doing, which is sort of thinking more thoughtfully about the role of religion in society as journalists when things are sometimes not seen, missed, a bit of a blind spot, overlooked. So hopefully this session will continue to deepen what we've been working on all day today, constitutional history, race, sort of the flow of how things overlap, but now more, a little bit more directly to religion. Both of these gentlemen are, well, I'll tell you in their bios how long they've been at it. Will wrote for a quarter century at Slate. He's just been at the Bulwark for a couple of years. Eugene Scott has been a sort of very steady, faithful voice from Arizona, back here, CNN, Washington Post, other places. So, which she's doing now at Axios. So, our idea is to sort of say, there's a bit of a failure by some outlets to cover ideological diversity. But why do some newsrooms still have a kind of blind spot on religion? Why are so many leading columnists, reporters, and editors who cover religious life less religious than their readers? Former New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet once said, I guess in 2016 after the Trump election, that the New York-based and the DC-based media powerhouses don't get religion. What can be done about that? At a time when institutional religion is declining, as we talked about earlier today, but still significant in the United States, these gentlemen in the industry for over roughly 3 decades apiece will reflect candidly on how they've come to see that in some ways religion is always in the room. So first, let me introduce Eugene Scott, who is a senior politics reporter covering congressional leadership at Axios. And he's also the co-author of the newsletter Hill Leaders, which you can get on. He previously covered national politics for the Washington Post. He hosted their next 4 years a podcast about the 2020 election. Prior to that, he was the DC correspondent for CNN Politics Digital. He's been an award-winning multimedia journalist for 2 decades. In that time, he's won multiple awards and fellowships in his work specifically related to covering politics, business, and education. He is an alum of the Harvard Kennedy School and has previously been a fellow at the Georgetown University IOP, Institute of Politics. Will Salatan, as mentioned, wrote for Slate for literally 25 years and has been at the Dispatch for the last...
Bulwark.
Oh, my word. Just tired
the
at the Bulwark.
The people's front of Judea.
That's right. Has been at the Bulwark for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
2 years, yeah. He's written about politics and science and technology. He's the author of the book Bearing Right in 2004 about the conservatives and the abortion war. He's also a graduate of Swarthmore College. So our thinking is Will's going to start and talk about this theme some, and then Eugene is going to contextualize that a bit and perhaps offer a little bit of encouragement and advice to you, and then over to you for conversation. Okay? Will, floor is yours.
Okay, great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I got to admit at the beginning that the last session made me a little bit uncomfortable because I've always had a personal animus against people like Simran, and I'm referring, of course, to Spurs fans. I am from Houston. I'm a long-suffering Houston Rockets fan, and although Simran did not personally do this, clearly the Spurs fans stole the ping pong ball from us that was supposed to get us Victor Wembanyama, and so I'm just going to try to get over my grievance about Houston and San Antonio.
That's right.
Come on, man. You had David Robinson, you had Duncan, and now this is just not right. Okay. Okay, so what I wanted to do for you is, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more interested in the texture and the reality of things, as opposed to sort of general advice. So I'll have some advice for you at the end. It's kind of brief, but I wanted to sort of focus on some real life examples of why it's so important to have your eyes open to religion when you're reporting about the world. So the first one is from when I was at Slate and I was writing about bioethics. I used to go to the bioethics commission that President Bush had. And they had this panel, they had a whole bunch of people on it, and it was in a conservative administration. But they had this diversity of views, and so I went to one of the discussions where they were talking about this project about how to get stem cells without creating a human embryo. And so this is what I wrote about it at the time. The people on the panel, some of the names you might recognize. Charles Krauthammer said the idea was troubling, creating this weird sort of non-embryo thing. Robert George said if the product wasn't an embryo, it was okay. Michael Sandel said it was creepy. Peter Lawler said the key was to avoid destroying embryos. Leon Cass, the council's chairman, said it might seem acceptable to some people, but dubious to others. And these two other council members, Mary Ann Glendon and Alfonso Gomez-Lobo, they endorsed the proposal. And what I wrote in the article was, with a couple of exceptions, the reactions fell into two camps. Catholics leaned one way, Jews the other. So this is something that I wouldn't have noticed if I didn't. I mean, I'm Jewish. And I was somewhat aware of sort of Catholic thought on this, but this was not superficially visible. You had to have a little bit of training to understand that what was going on in this debate was people who had come from a more sort of rational tradition of Catholicism, and then the sort of Jewish tradition, which I described as fuzzy. Not all Jews think in fuzzy terms, but it's a looser way of thinking. So that was one of my introductions to seeing what is ostensibly a non-religious event through a religious prism. Another example, let me give you a couple more examples from today. So we just had the House votes on aid to Israel and Ukraine, and the House Republicans voted 193 to 21 overwhelmingly for sending aid to Israel, but narrowly against, 112 to 101, against sending aid to Ukraine. So that's about 85 or 90 Republicans who voted one way or the other. Why? Well, one reason is if you saw the hearing that happened a couple of days earlier in the House, the president of Columbia was being interrogated about anti-Semitism on campus. And this is an actual quote from Representative Rick Allen of Georgia. He's interrogating the president of Columbia, and he says to her, "I tell my colleagues that Washington, D.C. is not the center of the universe. Jerusalem is the center of the universe." He says to her, "Are you familiar with Genesis 12:3? It's pretty clear. It was a covenant that God made with Abraham, and that covenant was real clear. If you bless Israel, I will bless you." And then he says to her, "Do you want Columbia University to be cursed by the God of the Bible?" He says, "We have Moses looking down on the entire body of Congress who gave us the law. Maybe you should have a course suggested for those who are having problems with all of this on the Bible and what's in the Bible and what will happen under the wrath of God." He literally said the wrath of God. Young people are being indoctrinated by these professors to believe this stuff, liberal claptrap, and they have no idea that they're going to be cursed by God, the God of the Bible and the God of our flag. Now, I'm not saying that 85 or 90 Republicans all switched based on this issue, but there are some people, and Rick Allen was one of those who voted for aid to Israel and not aid to Ukraine. In order to understand what the House did, part of what you need to understand is the religious views of people like Rick Allen. A few other examples. Mike Pence just wrote an op-ed about abortion. And in the op-ed, he wrote, "I was deeply disappointed when Mr. Trump, his former boss, stated that he considered abortion to be a state-only issue and would not sign a bill prohibiting late-term abortions after 15 weeks. What should concern us far more than the politics of abortion," Pence wrote, "is the immorality of ending an unborn human life." He's describing the unborn child. "She is created in the image of God, the same as you or me. Now is not the time to surrender any ground in the fight for the right to life. While the former president has sounded the retreat on life at the national level, I pray that he will rediscover the passion for life that defined our 4 years in office and rejoin the fight to end late-term abortions." Now, Mike Pence, as you may know, always introduces himself by saying, "I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order." That is not the way one would describe Donald Trump. And in fact, it's ludicrous for Pence to speak of Trump rediscovering his passion for this issue. Anyone who knows Trump, he never had a passion for this issue. He has no such passion. Donald Trump, when he spoke to the Faith and Freedom Conference 2 years ago, here's what he said. He asked the crowd if they were going to vote for him. And he said, "Oh, that's really nice. I appreciate it. I've done a lot for religion, I'll tell you. They don't want religion in our country, all right? I used to say that. I used to say," he's Biden, "he's not for religion. He's not for God. Remember they said it's going to be very close in Texas? And I said, wait a minute. He's against oil, guns, and God. And I won in a landslide. So that is the way Donald Trump is one of these nominally Christian people who, in fact, feels nothing. And you can see it in the way he talks about it versus the way Pence talks about it. You cannot understand the abortion issue and why these two men diverged if you do not understand the difference in faith between them. Fourth example. So I just gave you a cliche version of Christianity. Mike Johnson obviously decided to risk his career. I don't know what's the latest on the motion to vacate, to pass aid to Ukraine. And he explained it in a press conference this way. He said, he was asked about Marjorie Taylor Greene has a motion to vacate you. He said, I have a job to do here, and I'm going to do the job. If Marjorie brings the motion, she brings the motion, and we'll let the chips fall where they may. He said, people say there's a whirlwind right now. They say to me, you seem to be pretty calm all the time. How do you maintain that composure? And I remind myself of what John Quincy Adams said. He used to bring the same resolution over and over to end slavery in America, and he kept failing over and over and over. And as the story goes, a young member of Congress came up to him one day and said, why do you keep bringing the resolution? And he said, young man, it's very simple. He said, duty is ours, results are God's. And to me, that's a very liberating thought. I'm going to do my duty, and the results are not ultimately up to me. So I'm comfortable with that, and we'll see what happens, and we'll lay the chips down on the table then. You can't understand what Mike Johnson did without understanding how he views the world in terms of his faith, in terms of his understanding of God and his relationship with God and God's role in history and where Mike Johnson fits into history. If there was a point when Jim Jordan might have been speaker and they narrowly avoided that and they got Mike Johnson instead. And a lot of liberals said Mike Johnson's very conservative on things like homosexuality and abortion, and all that is true. But at this moment, it mattered that there was a religious man running the House of Representatives. In fact, the New York Times, when they wrote about this a couple days ago, did some backstage reporting, and they said, finally, about Mike Johnson, when his plan to work with Democrats to clear the way for aiding Ukraine met with an outpouring of venom from ultra-conservatives who were already threatening to depose him, Mr. Johnson, an evangelical Christian, knelt and prayed for guidance. Representative Michael McCall of Texas recalled the speaker telling him, quote, I want to be on the right side of history. So you can dislike Mike Johnson's faith when it's on issues you don't agree with, but sometimes it plays in a different way, and you have to understand that. A couple of other examples. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay. Chuck Schumer spoke out called basically for new elections in Israel, said they should change the government of Israel. And Donald Trump went on the radio and said, speaking of Schumer and the other Democrats, a couple days later, he said, I think they hate Israel. They hate Israel. The Democratic Party hates Israel. And Trump said, quote, any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion. They hate everything about Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves because Israel will be destroyed. So here's what Schumer actually said in his speech about Israel and the war in Gaza. Schumer said, quote, I speak for myself, but I also speak for so many mainstream Jewish Americans, a silent majority whose nuanced views on the matter have never been well represented in this country's discussions about the war in Gaza. As the first Jewish majority leader of the United States Senate and the highest-ranking Jewish elected official in America ever, I also feel very keenly my responsibility as Shomer Yisrael, a guardian of the people of Israel. I speak as a member of a community of Jewish Americans that I know very well. They are my family, my friends. Many of them are my constituents. Many of them are Democrats, and many are deeply concerned about the pursuit of justice. From the Talmud, Tikkun Olam, the call to repair the world, has driven Jews around the globe to do what is right. Schumer said, we love Israel in our bones, but he went on, Jewish people throughout the centuries have empathized with those who are suffering and who are oppressed because we have known so much of that ourselves. As the Torah teaches us, every human life is precious, and every single innocent life lost, whether Israeli or Palestinian, is a tragedy that, as Scripture says, destroys an entire world. What horrifies so many Jews, especially, is our sense that Israel is falling short of upholding these distinctly Jewish values that we hold so dear. We must be better than our enemies, lest we become them. You cannot understand what Chuck Schumer was saying if you do not understand that he was speaking as a Jew and for many other Jews. This was a debate and is a debate within Judaism. And it is for someone outside the faith like Trump to say you are against Israel, you hate Israel, just misunderstands, does not comprehend that this is a discussion about faith and values within Judaism and among Jews. So I'll throw in a couple of other faiths here. One is an article that I wrote beginning of January. Trump was running ads against Nikki Haley, and in the ad said, Haley joined Joe Biden in opposing Trump's visitor ban from terrorist nations. Her weakness puts us in grave danger. And if you looked at what they cited as their evidence that Haley opposed the travel ban, it was interviews in which Nikki Haley said that she supported a ban on travel from countries where there was a lot of terrorism. She supported preventing terrorists from coming here. And what she said she specifically opposed was Trump explicitly banning Muslims from coming to the United States. I mean, Trump said it out loud. No Muslims can come to the United States. Haley said that was wrong. So Trump runs this ad. And I wrote an article about this saying, this is the Muslim ban he's talking about. And I was really sort of dismayed that there was not more coverage of this. Because if this were Judaism, if this were my people, Jews, everyone would recognize that it was an invocation of anti-Semitism to bring that back. But because it was about Muslims and it wasn't explicitly said, this didn't get covered, the fact that he was bringing back, in effect, the Muslim ban. And it didn't even matter that Trump was out on the campaign trail talking about, do you remember this, Barack Hussein Obama? Every time he would say Obama, he'd say, Barack Hussein, and he would hit it hard. Barack Hussein Obama. And he did this to Haley. He said, she's like siding with Barack Hussein Obama against my travel ban. So I think this was a failure of journalism, and I do have to wonder whether if we had more Muslims in American journalism, whether we would have covered this better. And so the last one I want to mention is Vivek Ramaswamy, who obviously ran for president as a Republican, went to the Family Leader Forum in Iowa. So this is a conservative Christian organization in Iowa. And the head of this thing, Bob Vanderplatz, who is an evangelical Christian, says to Ramaswamy, he's going to ask each of you a difficult question. The one he asked to Ramaswamy is, you're Hindu, you're not Christian. So I have a lot of people who ask me, how can we trust you? What do you believe? And so Ramaswamy gives this speech. He says to the group, this is impromptu, he's a good extemporaneous speaker. He says, I'm Hindu. I believe there's one true God. I believe God put each of us here for a purpose. He says, I went to a Christian high school, St. X in Cincinnati. We read the 10 Commandments. We read the Bible. I believe God is real. There's one true God. Don't take his name in vain. Honor the Sabbath. Respect your parents. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness, etc. He said to the crowd, these values, they're familiar to me. They don't belong to Hindus. But these values, they don't belong to Christians either. They belong to God. Can I be a president who promotes Christianity across this country? I can't, for a number of reasons. I'm not Christian. I don't think that's actually what we should want the US president doing either. That's a job for pastors and others. But will I stand for those shared values? Will I promote them in the example that we set? Revive them in the next generation of Americans? You're darn right I will, because that's my duty. Now, I wanted to talk about this in something we were doing at the Bulwark, and one of my colleagues was like, Ramaswamy, I don't want to cover him because he's a fraud. And Ramaswamy is a fraud. He's a con man and he's a whack job and all that stuff. Sorry to anyone. But he's nuts, and I understand this argument. But I thought what he said here was important. And sometimes frauds say important things. And this was an important thing, and this was not covered. And so I feel like if the Bulwark we have Christians, we have Jews, but we don't have Muslims, we don't have Hindus on staff, and I wonder if our coverage would have been different. And I wonder if this was also, I thought, just a completely overlooked moment in the campaign. So what I wanted to conclude with is just, like, what advice do I have to tell you about any of this? I wanted to put these examples on the table to show how important it is. Eugene's going to have better advice than I will. But my one piece of advice is about diversity. We're in a time when people talk a lot about diversity, right? And we're all sort of aware of it. But things have a way of ideas become ossified. They become slogans. Diversity has become a slogan. It's become, well, do we have enough of this group or that group or the other group represented? And do we have the Catholic point of view? Do we have the Black point of view, the Latino point of view? And it's not that simple. I want to encourage everybody, think about religion as another form of diversity to begin with. if you are looking at a bunch of conservative Christians and you think these are not, I shouldn't take this seriously, take them as seriously as you would take an ethnic group. Like these are people who have a view of the world. Understand them, bring them into the conversation, speak to them. And the other thing I want to encourage is looking at diversity within groups, because there isn't a black point of view, a Jewish point of view, a Muslim point of view. There is Sunni and Shia. There is conservative and liberal. There is Orthodox and Reform, right? And so explore the diversities within groups, not just between them. And that's we can talk more in the session, but I want to turn it over to Eugene.
Awesome. It's so great being with you all this afternoon. It is, I think, very highly in faith Form, and you all should, I say this humbly, feel honored to be here, to be able to mix with each other. I recognize so many bylines or tweets or X's or whatever we're calling them, and look forward to hearing from you later. My talk will be brief and hopefully not too sermony, but when we were asked to speak about journalism, religion, and vocation, I immediately go into finding your why, figuring out your why, and I think that's a very important thing, considering how young many of you all are. You're in a place right now where you can really spend some time unpacking that. And so one thing where I would start off with that is sharing with you how I got into journalism. So I was born 43 years ago today, and and I grew up here in D.C., in Washington, D.C., the son of Hill staffers. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with D.C., but historically, pre-gentrification was called Chocolate City. And one of the reasons it was called Chocolate City is because it had one of the largest Black, educated, professional demographics in the country. In part due to the illustrious Howard University, but just also because DC is probably, the DMV is one of the more highly educated metro areas in the country, and it's one of the few areas where I guess all ties, all boats rise, whatever, cliche. And so I was always watching the news as a kid, but I did not see my community reflected on the news when I was watching local news. And I was young and naive, and I was like, most Black people on the news are either suspected of committing crimes or athletes, and that's not bad, because the Black people do those things, but that's not all that Black people do. And so I knew very early on that I wanted to be a journalist. And in high school, I was a part of a show on BET News called Teen Summit, which was a program way before your time, most of you all's time, where they had teen journalists come together and talk about issues of the day. It was canceled for 106 in Park, which you're probably even more familiar with, because more people want to watch music videos than listen to teens tell news story, I being one of those people. So I understood that, and I got to cover local politics for more than a decade out in real America, in Charlotte and Kansas City and Phoenix, as Josh mentioned, I'm sorry. Then I went to grad school, hoping to transition out of journalism, and was not successful at that because I don't know much about my identity outside of being a journalist. But more seriously, I really did discover that the best place for me to write about the issues that I cared about, policy and politics, were in the mainstream media, not think tanks, which is what I thought I was going to do, in part because no one reads white papers. But more seriously, so much of what Will was talking about, one of the joys, and you all understand this, of being in the media is, quite frankly, the diversity of our readers and listeners. I mean, we have people who barely got out of high school or still in high school who listen to our podcast, and PhDs as well. And I wanted all of the people who are reflected and represented in our society, regardless of their religious identity, their age identity, their educational identity, to consume what I was producing, what we're producing, because it matters. And so I took a class that I loved at the Kennedy School that I think Josh took as well, called Religion, Politics, and Policy. After that, I went to CNN to cover the 2016 election. My first day there was the day that Trump announced he was running for president. And I was of the impression primarily that I would be covering like religion in 2016. And I got to write about that a lot, but if any of you all remember, there was a lot to write about in 2016. So I wrote about some other things, but I remember talking to my classmates. So the Kennedy School has students from like at least 100 countries. And a lot of my international friends were like, what does religion have to do with politics? And that was a shocking question for me. I am named after my grandfather, who was a pastor and like vice chair of the state's Democratic Party. And so, I come from a Black Baptist tradition of Southerners where people preached about voting and civic engagement. And so I didn't understand why that wasn't obvious to some of my international classmates. But one of the things we've learned at Faith Angle, and once I've learned, the more I got into this industry, it's not obvious to a lot of people the role of religion in journalism. And one of the things I've really enjoyed, and that is probably more clear to you all than elder millennials like me, is that when you look at religion more broadly and look at it from a perspective of faith and values and worldview, all of that shapes how people move in the world regarding their business, their politics, even sports, entertainment. And one of the things I think I've really enjoyed over this last decade is helping people understand the values and motivations of why people do what they do. And, journalism is having a bit of a reckoning in the last few years where conversations and debates about like bias and objectivity. And I'm so here for that because I think we historically have had this like false notion that journalists are far more objective than they actually are. And, as someone who's Black, gay, and agnostic, I'm at tables often where I understand that that's just not true. I think what you all get to do moving forward, because your circles are, I'm sure, more diverse than our circles were, and we see all the data and the stats in terms of, the rise of the nuns and religious minority groups growing in population. You get to bring questions to your meetings, to your bosses that were never considered before and that are so very important right now, more than ever before, if we are going to maintain the little bit of trust that our industry still has in our industry. I was speaking yesterday at a nonprofit called Faith and Politics Institute. They had a fellowship program and it was really great. And we were talking about diversity earlier, and one of the questions that one of the young people had, quite frankly, was the lack of socioeconomic diversity in our industry. And it's real. You all know, the Ivy Leagues are way more represented in these organizations than they should be. It's so rare to find someone like who went to community college, and we get so many stories wrong because of our blind spots, and they're well intentioned, and I think a lot of our elders are very defensive because they weren't trying to be harmful, in addition to the fact that like journalists are just inherently a little insecure. But the reality is we need to do a better job of covering our country for two reasons. One, it's becoming increasingly diverse, and if we're going to accurately represent communities, we need to reflect that. But also, my pet peeve is our country has always been far more diverse than we've ever covered it, right? And so, like, Muslims are not new, lesbians are not new, right? Like, and people are acting as if these groups are just unheard of, and we've done our readers and the world a disservice. I mean, so much of what you understand about the world, whether you know it or not, is through the media, especially worlds outside of your world, right? And I know it's such a hard time in this industry right now. Layoffs are all over the place. It's harder to get where you all are, and it can be really depressing. But I feel like if I were a younger person, I would be so excited because I think you have an opportunity to really get some things right that we've gotten wrong for decades. And I think an organization like Faith Angle brings you together and makes you think about these things. And not to pressure you, I don't look at you as like just future journalists, young journalists, but like future newsroom leaders, right? Because even though the industry is arguably more diverse than it has been, leadership isn't, okay? Like, let's be honest. And so I want to challenge you to figure out your why you did it, why you're still in it, because that is what is going to have to motivate you sometimes, because it's not always the great salaries, right? It's not always the awards. It's not always the loving fan mail. And what I've learned in the last 10 years, as Will has too, and which has been very different from the first half of our career, is we're under attack from leaders of our country in ways that we never have been before, right? And I've been at Trump rallies, and they turn around and boo you and all that kind of stuff. You're in those moments, you're going to have to figure out why it is. Remind yourself why it is what you do, why you do what you do. And if I sound like preachy and from a perspective of like calling, as if I'm addressing this from a perspective of calling, I think that is something to think about. And not, it doesn't have to be a calling from like on high. Unless you believe it's a calling from on high, that's fine as well. But really, like, this is an opportunity for you to ask yourself, what is it that I am hoping to do, the impact I'm hoping to have in this industry? And this is the hard part. Everybody will have a last day in this industry. And a good number of us, our last day will be sooner than we want it to be. That's just the reality of the industry. But when that last day comes, even if it does come before you want it to, I hope you are able to look back at your career and say, I left this industry better off than it was when I got there, right? And that's not measured by awards or clicks or subscriptions to newsletters. That's what you know to yourself. I wrote this story, I elevated this voice, I pushed back on this long-held belief that isn't actually accurate. And I helped people understand their neighbor better than they did before. And that is what, I humbly have been able to do. But it's only because I've been more intentional about it and more thoughtful about it because of gatherings like Faith Angle Forum. And it's not something that just happens by accident, right? And so I hope that you find yourself from this, not weekend, I don't know what day it is. Every day is Trump Day in this world, Trump trial, whatever. But I hope that's something you take away with you from this time together, and that can motivate you and inspire you as you move forward. And if you figure out, you know what, this isn't for me, I should do something else, that's awesome too. And that's one of the joys of your generation. Like, you don't have to do the same thing for 50 years like a lawmaker. So I hope that somehow inspires you a bit. And I hope it wasn't depressing.
Great. Yeah. Guys, first of all, it's really important. All right, so a lot of good wisdom and counsel. Let's start first with Tamara from PR.
Can you tell us your name and where you're from?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm Tamara Jokes-Boer. I'm from The Economist.
Nice.
So I want to talk a bit, Eugene, you talked a little bit about this already, but I do want to hear from Will as well, about class and the role of covering religion. So, you know, I've been in some privileged spaces, The Economist. I have a PhD from Stanford, places where a lot of rich people go. And I've been surprised where you talk about religion, and I've been in a room with Stanford PhDs in education, and you ask them how many people in this country are religious, and they'll say 15%. They have no concept, and they're shocked, and they won't believe you. And I had a friend who's a religious education PhD scholar, and she had to give all the receipts. They didn't believe her at all. What do you think is the role of class when we talk about the role of religion in journalism?
I have some thoughts on this, but
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I come from Black people from the South who are descended from people who were enslaved, and I have a lot of my little brother's a minister. I have a lot of church friends, but I also have a lot of agnostic and atheist friends. Very few of them are Black, and they don't understand why faith has been so strong in the Black community. I was like, well, one of the reasons is when you look around at your neighbors and your condition in the world historically, and your main takeaway is only heaven can help us because we cannot depend on the government or business or our neighbor. You lean into faith. And I think a lot of times what I have discovered when you're in places where, not that PhDs from Stanford's lives have been perfect, but it's probably fair to say they have been less challenged than my classmates in DC public schools. There wasn't a lot of reliance on prayer or need for prayer. And I think what happens a lot of times, what I have found also being at these fancy places, is people are really deeply unaware of what the lives of their neighbors look like. And I use neighbor broadly because a lot of these people aren't neighbors with people whose lives have been really challenged. And it's really affecting how they understand the world and how they're communicating. And when I say neighbors, I think, and I don't have numbers right here, but I do think we have data that shows that people who are from more working class backgrounds and lower income backgrounds are more faithful or have higher degrees of faith and belief, which would make sense. And it's, many of these institutions, like you said, The Economist, these aren't folks coming from inner city public schools. So the line from inner city public school to The Economist is very, right, exactly. And I think that's one of our blind spots. People don't understand why people. I mean, lastly, I remember some of the earlier days of Trump's 2016 campaign, and people would criticize a lot of the white working class voters in the red states, and they're responding as if they're at church. It's a lot of these people need a savior. A lot of people who live in New York and DC and cover America haven't spent time in some of these communities and don't understand how depleted they are and how hopeless they can be and how they yearn for someone to come in and fix that. Because they live in places where things are great. And so I think about all the time. I'll just say this: I have found a lot of times when people have been less faithful throughout their lives. It's not to suggest that their lives have been perfect, but when I listen to their stories, it seems like they have not needed a miracle from above to come and help them out in ways that I think we know that a lot of people, especially globally, we see what's happening in the Middle East and people are just crying out to God, asking for help. And it's also one of the reasons I'm not, quite frankly, I don't think a pretentious, self-righteous unbeliever, because I know why people feel the need to believe.
Yeah, it's interesting how that secularization thesis suggested that for a long time, the richer countries got, the less religious they would become. And then eventually Peter Berger, did a bit of wrestling with that and said, actually, there's a desecularization thesis, at least present in the United States. And that may be changing a bit today, but for the sweep of the last 50 years, still a very religious place and a very wealthy place at the same time. So it kind of shakes some of the class assumptions and stereotypes. All right, we've got a lot of questions. Let's go. Brianna Frank from USA Today, please.
Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I am curious about, we're talking about this goal of having journalism, acknowledge this blind spot of religion. And I'm curious whether you see that as an individual project, so like us as individuals forming these relationships, figuring out how to better cover this and talking to our colleagues about it, or if this is more of an institutional project in terms of do we need newsroom trainings or, how do we get more people on board? For example, I'm doing a master's program right now in religious studies at the University of Virginia, but I also understand not every journalist can just go get a master's degree to try to figure this out. So, and also, as you mentioned earlier, our mindset might be very different from our newsroom leaders, for example. So I'm just wondering, where the responsibility for this mostly lies, and as individuals, what are practical ways that we can try to be better in our own reporting?
Try that one.
I'll just say briefly, my answer to you would be, it's an institutional problem, but all institutional problems start with individual solutions. So it's just, I'm a big believer in initiative. I mean, if you're in a place where you can't take initiative, then there's larger problems. But basically, my suggestion is start by setting an example. And it does mean that, like trainings, this is another way in which the whole diversity industry bothers me. We sort of reify things and they become like a meeting you go to instead of a thing you do. So part of the point of being a journalist is finding stories. And as you know, you come across all sorts of things, and it's a selection process. And I think if you think of yourself as taking responsibility for this, your job is to look for and then find the right example of a story to do that's going to show your colleagues and your bosses how to do this right, how to broaden the lens. And then maybe you can sort of pull people in that way. But it does put a lot of responsibility on you to get it right, because if you do it wrong or it doesn't work, they're going to be like, see, this is why we don't cover this stuff.
But I will say briefly, so I completely agree, and I think you start with individualistic. And, all I've really ever covered was politics. I mean, I did some stints in business and education, but never not covered politics. And so finding a faith religion angle in politics is always kind of easy, because at some point a candidate's going to be at a church or say something anti-Semitic or Islamophobic, or and so you find your way in there. But what I would say is, depending on what your beats are, you may have to pitch stories that are like a side project, in addition to whatever it is that you're doing, that help your higher ups understand why this is important. And so if you're writing about young people and values, or in response to Gaza, it may be something. I think one of the biggest challenges is you may have to take this on above and beyond what it is that you're doing already. That will help your leaders see the value in it. And in terms of traction or awards and feedback, I believe somebody will eventually get it. That's where you start right now, until you get in leadership and can call some shots.
Christian Hall with Bloomberg in the White House.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to comment on something that you mentioned, Will, earlier, about the importance of diversity and why we need that in newsrooms for our coverage, which I totally agree with. But how do we have that conversation in this era of, anti-DEI, anti-wokeness? I mean, how do we have those conversations when we see in corporate America this backlash against those things?
So it's complicated, and the implementation will be way more important than what I'm going to say to you, which is the general idea. But there are hooks for people who, even the sort of anti-woke movement, these movements crest, obviously. There's been a woke movement, there's an anti-woke movement, it will crest. But the people who say they're against wokeness they have perspectives that they want to include. They don't think of that as wokeness. But the project here is you're not aiming to have a select, here's our list of approved groups, and we want you to cover them. You're trying to, the larger project is open your eyes and see people who are not part of our coverage or who are undercovered. And those people believe that conservative Catholics are undercovered. They believe even that white evangelicals are undercovered. They believe that there's all sorts of perspectives that are left out. And they call that anti-wokeness. But it's actually part of the same idea of what you don't see. You're not part of this group. If you can just get them to buy into, and through some clever selection, this idea of broadening the lens, then you're advancing the larger project. And maybe they will stop seeing this as adversarial, you know, where it's like, because they feel slighted. They're like, well, you're covering, you know, people of color, so what about white people? And you'd be like, well, like, that's interesting too, you know, the people in rural Appalachia, you know, let's talk about that. So I would encourage you to focus on broadening the lens and choosing groups that will bring in that larger constituency.
So my brief response to that, Christian, is, and I could be wrong, but I think I'm not, is that some of these companies that are responding, media companies that are putting less of an emphasis on diversity, will begin to recognize the importance of it again once we start missing stories, right? Once the competition gets the story because they have somebody who knows this community. Because at the end of the day, these are businesses and people want to be first and they want to win the awards and they want their people on TV talking about what they wrote. And so I think there's a bit of a overcorrection in response to the attacks that they're going to correct. And I'll say this lastly, I remember when in terms of like changes in the industry, when I was in Phoenix, I used to sit beside a reporter who had been at that newspaper longer than I'd been alive. Like, I don't know how many of you are still in like local newspapers, but like he's just like a character. We miss some of that in our current industry that we don't have anymore. And you know, I was young and would always be complaining about stuff. And he said, if you see a change in the newsroom that you don't like, don't worry about it. It'll change again. And it was this wisdom of someone who had seen so many different initiatives and goals and things. And so wait and see. There'll be a shift eventually. Like, oh, now we do need more people of color and more women and more Muslims. And yeah, so.
Well, in Chicago. Okay, Lauren Constantino from Miami Herald.
Hi, thank you so much for this discussion. You know, I feel like I come from a background of like community engagement and doing journalism from that point of view. Things like holding events at public libraries to hear from the community and the issues that they have, and crowdsourcing and things like that. And that's where you start, searching for your stories. And I feel like this is such a good model to implement, and I've been kind of trying to do that in my own newsroom. But, you know, my question is just how do we convince leaders that there might be a better way to report this story or to find stories that's more inclusive with the people that we're covering when our business model is antithetical to that idea, because we favor coverage in cities that are more affluent. Like we just do. We have, you know, Coral Gables reporter and you know, not we have a Hialeah reporter now, but you know what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I'm just wondering, like, you know, some of these things that takes more time, like my role, religion reporter, is grant funded. It's not because McClatchy believes that this is an important position, you know, so I'm just wondering like how we convince leaders to get that buy-in for these methods that I see as sort of fixes to the problems that you guys are discussing.
I had the problem that you had, I had in Phoenix. And so just to be really honest, I didn't get into local news to cover affluent suburbs. I'm not trying to offend anyone, but I just find these places kind of boring and not really interesting and, you know, vanilla. And so I wanted to cover South Phoenix. And what I had to do, and it was hard, it kind of related to what I was sharing with Brianna, is you're going to have to pick up those projects on your own. in addition to what it is you are doing. And so you got to do your job and try to pick up some, a story here and there. And if it does well, if it wins an award, they will notice. They will notice. And it's hard because you're like, I'm already overextended and I'm tired and I'm not just a journalist. There are other things I would like to do as well. And if you don't have time to do it all the time, that doesn't mean you care about it less. I'm not saying like if you really are called, like whatever. But if there's stories that you want to tell that are not a priority for your managers, you're going to have to go out of your way and tell it. And I will say, as someone who did that quite a bit, it's rewarding in the long run. It's tiring, but it's rewarding.
So win awards.
The good thing is that there are more, and I mean local awards, like there are more awards competitions than you ever realize. But even online traffic, they know when something is happening. Yeah.
So I cover race. So I've had a lot of uncomfortable conversations with people, intense conversations. But one of the things I've noticed is bringing up faith or religion actually tends to be the thing that people are most uncomfortable being asked about and talking about. And I was just curious if that's been your experience as well, and if you have any ideas about how to make people comfortable talking about something that they often find too personal or too kind of private to speak about.
I would have thought that would be helpful, because so often you can make a connection with people's faith across lines of race, and that if this is causing more problems, then I have to rethink that whole idea. But I wish I had a constructive idea. Maybe Eugene does.
So you write about race, and you mean there are times you've had stories and you've had to bring in religion. How?
Yeah, basically just being curious how people's religion informs what their beliefs are about a certain topic.
Yeah.
And I've heard so many times people say something and then say, actually, please don't use that. That's too personal. Yeah. Or not want to talk about something at all because it feels like, I think they're more nervous than any other topic that I've dealt with that what they believe is going to be misconstrued or that it's going to be misrepresented in some way.
No, that's real. I mean, I think, especially a lot of faiths call you to believe some weird things that people outside of your faith would be like, how could you? You know what I mean? And so I understand that. But I would say this: if someone was like, please don't share that, that'd be too personal. I just encourage being patient with people and say, is there something that you would feel comfortable sharing? That you, because I could be wrong. I have found that people who have faith aren't opposed to sharing their faith at all. They're just parts of their faith that they're less comfortable with going public about, and and versus other opportunities. And so I would say just work with people a bit. And I mean, my one of the things I love that helps get to values and worldview and faith is figuring out. I'm obsessed with the decision-making process. I'm like, how did you decide that was the right thing to do, or how'd you get there? Or walk me through the steps. Because at some point, somebody's gonna be like, well, I prayed about it, or I taught my mom this, or I read this, and blah blah blah. Help you figure out their worldview.
Reese Gorman with Daily Beast.
Is there a way that journalists not from communities can learn how to better cover them? I mean, I'm from San Antonio, went to school in Oklahoma, worked in Oklahoma. Really, I'm 29 total elected Democrats in Oklahoma. So my beat at Daily Beast at the Washington Examiner before was Republicans, because I knew how to cover them. Don't really even know how to, I don't talk to a lot of Democrats on the Hill. I cover Capitol Hill. And so it's that's not really my beat. And I think even if it was, I wouldn't properly know how to cover them. And whereas Republicans, there's nothing they could say that would shock me, because I've heard everything at Thanksgiving with family. So how can how can people not a part of certain communities learn how to better cover those communities if they're not from there and they genuinely have no idea really kind of what it's like to live in those communities or kind of understand their belief systems?
It's not about learning, it's about living. It's about immersion is the best way to learn anything. It's the best way to learn a language, a culture. My daughter's in Cameroon right now. She's going to come. She's on some program where they're teaching they're teaching the kids in a class, but what she's really learning is in the community, in the country, and that's the way it is anywhere in this country too. And so the thing is, I couldn't. If somebody tried to teach you about it, you wouldn't get half of what you would get just by being there. And suddenly you would see something, you would experience something. Somebody says something, you would open your eyes to this whole category of things you weren't even looking for. Again, super easy for me to say, much harder for you to execute. So good luck on it.
Just briefly, it's true though. You got to go where the people you're covering do life. So when I moved to Kansas City, I had never been to the Midwest. And I was at Friday night football games. I do not like football, but in Kansas City, that's where people were. I was in barbecue festivals. There was I covered this suburb outside of Kansas City called Lenexa, Kansas, Spanish capital of the world, and they had a shop at the time called the Pie Lady, who used to sell pies at the farmers market. Then she got her own shop. She knew everything about everybody. And I would go in there, I'd buy a piece of pie, she'd be running her mouth, I'd get another piece of pie because she's just talking, and I would find out. And I wasn't gonna find out about what was happening in this community if I wasn't in this community. And it's one of the things I loved about local news. And I mean, one of the things I used to hate about being on the receiving end of local news as a kid, I try not to give Washington Post hell because I loved working there, but I mean, as a kid, and they help pay for college and everything. But a lot of times people would be writing about communities they didn't live in, they didn't shop in, they didn't worship in, they didn't go to. They were getting stuff wrong left and right. And so you got to go where the people you write about do life.
I just want to the three most important words Eugene said, in my opinion, were running her mouth. That was really important because you have your questions that you go in with.
Yes.
And your questions are, I don't want to say ignorant, but they're not as informed as they would be.
Yeah.
Let people talk,
Yeah.
and you will learn what the right questions are.
Yep.
That's good. All right, can we take two final questions together? Jonquilyn Hill at Vox and Faith Pinho at Los Angeles Times, and then we'll wrap from there. But two together, okay?
Yeah, thank you all so much for doing this. This is great. We've talked a lot about organized religion, and of course it's going to vary from person to person, religion to religion, denomination to denomination. But I'm running into so many more people who aren't part of an organized religion but are spiritual. It's I'm going to manifest. Yeah, I know my sun, moon, and rising, all these things. And it's I'm curious how we include those perspectives, especially when they're so individualized versus, there's a strict almost dogma that most organized religions have.
That's great. And we invited Perry Bacon to come tonight. I'm not sure if he's in or not, but he is around these circles as well and has done a lot of writing on this subject as well. Faith.
Yeah, thanks. This is super fun. I'm always curious from religion reporters, how much of your own religious identity do you disclose in interviews? How much do you use that in interviews as a tool? Just curious how that comes out.
On the subject of the spirituality and people's, it's hard because any one person is not a story. You're looking for a pattern, obviously. Sometimes the only thing I would wonder is, do people who practice, who have their own spirituality, are they entirely alone, or are they connected in somehow, even through the internet, to other people who share this? Where did they get their ideas from? They must know somebody. So I think these networks exist. They're not exactly, churches. They're not congregations, but they have some of the similar characteristics. And I would just try to, when you speak to anyone who has this, try to pull on whatever threads they have. And the next time you run across someone else like that, again, try to pull on the threads and see if you can find a network, a pattern.
I mean, the nature of nuns, to your point, is just that it's not an organization, it's not a denomination. And so just when you write that and explain that, when you write that, or you have a podcast, right? Mm-hmm. You explain that, and it helps people understand that you're talking a little more individualistically. But what I've come to learn about covering religion as a whole, a lot of people's Christianity and Judaism is very individualistic as well, right? And so I think one of the things that has been confusing to a lot of people is that someone says, I'm a Catholic, and you're like, okay, I know what that means. And you really have no idea what it means to that person, right? And so it would be in our best interest to over-explain what this person's faith and worldview looks like in all situations, not just nuns. Secondly, I was going to say, Faith, regarding what I disclose. So I rarely, a lot of people who know me don't know that I'm agnostic, and I'm not like closeted agnostic or anything, but it's just people have all these ideas about what it means not to believe, and it could get unnecessarily awkward. But as a journalist, I am always trying to find common ground with people. And so if it seems relevant, like, so if you know, I'll mention that my little brother's a minister, or that I'm named after my grandfather and he was a pastor. If they want to think that I'm Baptist from that, that's on them. That's not what I said.
That's right.
But I will say what I need to say to help bring down walls, because that's important. But I try not to share a lot about myself, because, you know, I'm a little old school as a journalist, and that it's not always relevant. But I do know, especially when you're talking to a member of a community that's been underrepresented and misrepresented in the media, you may have to share a little bit more about who you are to build trust. Not in a way that's manipulative, but it's just the reality of going up to people and asking questions. I will say, lastly, I am shocked at how many people just talk to strangers, period. I've told my family, I'm like, don't ever talk to a reporter. Like, seriously, I don't want us to get misrepresented, and then you'll be mad, and like it would have never happened if you never talked to them in the first place. But like I've gone up to people at like I used to be a police reporter, which I hated, and like I've gone up to people in tragic situations, and they just talk, and I'm just blown away. And so there are ways that we can make talking to us easier. But I say all that to say, I'm just grateful that people talk to us as much as they do.
Tyler has some riches on that. So I would just underscore the line about some work to try to understand what's happening, particularly in the lower two generations around nuns and spiritual but not religious and curious. It's an interesting, massive departure, and there have got to be some more stories there. So I think that's an interesting one. Finally, want to just close with one story relevant to what Will said, which is one of these guys' fellow advisors is David Brooks on this faith angle group that tries to generate topics every half year together. And he had a friend who went to the Trinity School in New York, which is Upper West Side. It's a great place. Yep. One day, one of his friends who was Jewish came out of the school, and his dad was picking him up, and his dad said, what'd you learn at school today? He said, well, actually, we learned about the meaning of the name of the school, Trinity. It turns out it means Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the father looked at his son. He said, now, you listen here, boy, you listen good. We're Jewish. There's only one God, and we don't believe in him. So belief is complicated.
It is.
This is a really rich session, you guys. Thank you very much for all the work.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.